Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, scholars, and colleagues, Professor Dr. Abdul Aziz, Professor Dr. Abdul Aziz, Professor Dr. Osman Bakar, Professor Dr. Murad American, and Professor Madia, Dr. Feham, and our esteemed guest today, Dr. ERMIN SINANOVIC. And it is my great honor and privilege to welcome you all to the Distinguished Scholar Lecture Series number 9 today. And we are blessed to have with us Dr. ERMIN SINANOVIC, a prominent scholar and the executive director of the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World, CICW, at Shenandoah University. Okay, before that, maybe we could have a welcoming some words from Professor Osman Bakar.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Yes, I also welcome Dr. ERMIN SINANOVIC, the Executive Director of CICW in Virginia, SHENANDOAH University, for his visit here today. I think it has been quite some time ago that we have not met. I think the last time, I remember we actually in this room as well, so welcome. For all of you who may not know, Dr. ERMIN is a familiar face in Malaysia. I think he has a very important thing to do now. I mean, this is a very strategic center, the Center for Islam and the Contemporary World in Virginia. I think it's an important institute. It is new, but already we received the reception, the favorable reception from academics. It has already made its name, basically, in the world. So congratulations to the center. But on our part, our interest more because we, some time back, I think that was just before COVID, we signed a MOA, Memorandum of Agreement, not MOU, MOA. And we decided to start with a few programs, one of which was basically it was exchange of our students. So one of our PhD students, the Hazizi, Brother Hazizi, he was invited to the center. He spent some time there at the expense of the host. Thank you very much. And in fact, Brother Aziz has already got his PhD. Alhamdulillah. Yeah, he's now teaching at the Department of History in the main campus in Gombak. And I think one of your staff, Dr. Yunus, also came here and we discussed a few some progress, but unfortunately because of the COVID, we were not able to implement it. But now I think it's with his visit now, Dr. ERMIN, we can revive the shelved program, inshallah. I think can look forward to more collaboration in research, in seminars, in even exchange of students, I think, inshallah. So thank you very much for kindly visiting us. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Osman. And we may start with Al-Fatiha. Thank you, everybody, for your presence right here in ITCR and those in online. And before that, I will introduce our speaker for today, Dr. SINANOVIC's impressive career. He is an executive director at the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World at Shenandoah University, where he also serves as a scholar in residence. And his impressive career includes his role as the Director of Research and Academic Programs at the International Institute of Islamic Thought, IIIT. He has also taught in the Department of Political Science at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. His academic journey includes earning a MA and a PhD in political science from the Maxwell School of Syracuse University. Did I pronounce it right? Syracuse University. So Dr. SINANOVIC's research interests are diverse and significant. They include the transnational Islamic revival, Islamist activism, the politics of Southeast Asia, contemporary Islamic thought, and the institutionalization of Islam in the Balkans and Southeast Asia. In addition to his scholarly achievement, Dr. SINANOVIC is multilingual. He is speaking Bosnian, English, Arabic, and Malay, which enhances his ability to engage with a wide array of cultural and academic contexts. And today, Dr. SINANOVIC will be speaking on a highly pertinent and thought-provoking topic, the Great Interregnum, Islamic Thought in the 21st Century. And this lecture promises to offer deep insights into the evolving landscape of Islamic thoughts and its implications for the contemporary world. Without further ado, let us open our hearts and minds to the wisdom and insights that Dr. SINANOVIC will share with us today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. ERMIN SINANOVIC to the stage, please.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa bihi nasta'een. والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الأمين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you so much for this kind introduction. Thank you, Professor Osman, for arranging this, to the Dean for also welcoming us here. Alhamdulillah, the CICW and ISTAC already have a working relationship, and we are looking to expand and deepen that relationship in the near future. Some of you may know that I'm also a graduate of ISTAC. I got my master's degree here in 2001, not here, the old campus, in Damansara in 2001, and also graduate of IIUM with a double degree in IRKH and political science as well before that. With that being said, I don't want to waste time on the introductions. I want to delve directly into the topic. So if we could have the slides, otherwise I'll have to improvise, you know. So the topic, the Great Interregnum, Islam and Muslim in the 21st Century. So what I'm going to do in this lecture is going to offer some thoughts and ideas on where we are today with regard to Islamic thought, by looking at how we got here, and then offering a few ideas of how we can move forward. Now, it's a very tentative proposal and very brief, but one that hopefully will stimulate thinking and that will help us understand the situation that we're in when it comes to Islamic thought, and perhaps some ways of thinking how we can get out of the predicament that we're in and continue developing Islamic thought in ways that would fit the needs of the Muslims in the 21st century. So I can use this, right? See if it works. And it's not working. So what do I need to do? Make it work. I can just...
Yeah. Oh, okay, we didn't turn it on.
Okay. Jadi. Too much technology. Okay. So now it's working. This one? Is it? Oh, okay. So the main argument that I'm presenting to you here today is that the Islamic revival, as it developed over the last 5 or 6 decades, has ran its course, leaving Muslim societies in a great interregnum. This period of crisis, as it is obvious by now, is characterized by intercommunal conflicts, interstate and proxy wars, and general instability. And the interregnum has been drawn from the thought of a famous Italian sociologist, Antonio Gramsci. And this is a well-known quote and statement by him in one of his works, where he says that the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. I call this the great interregnum because what we are seeing today is a lull in Islamic thought that is not unprecedented. We've had situations like this in the past, but we are at the moment where the old, as we know it, is dying. That is to say, the most recent developments in Islamic thought seems to have ran its course, lost its dynamism, and are being on, to say metaphorically, on medical support for a while now. But the new hasn't come to the fore yet. And so this interregnum obviously refers to the period between the two rules, right? When you have a king that is gone and the new king hasn't been appointed yet, you have that instability. So that is the situation that we're in right now, I think, when it comes to Islamic thought and to the Muslim world in general. And I would like to examine how did we come to this point and then try to understand and figure out what we can do at this moment to move forward, to help this new be born. And as you know, every birth is a very difficult process and a very painful one at that as well. Not that we men would know, but at least this is what we can observe. So how did we get here? The Islamic revival that I'm referring to, of course, is the most recent wave that we've seen from the 1960s or the 1970s. So the second part of the 20th century, all the way up until pretty much the Arab Spring, which has in many ways struck a mortal blow to that wave of Islamic revival. And I take no pleasure in saying that because I wish it would have continued. But I think we would be denying a historical fact if we didn't admit that that particular wave is coming, if not has already come to an end. What was interesting during this whole process was that Islamic revival and modernity have been in constant conversation. You see, when you read a lot of works on Islamic revival in the 20th century, you will often find that people were describing it as an anti-modern movement, a movement that was rebellion against modernity. In my understanding, actually, Islamic revival was thoroughly a modern movement that was in constant conversation with modernity. And the goal, or one of the goals of Islamic revival, was to provide a developmental alternative for the Muslim world. When the Muslim world faced its post-colonial moment, at the end of the World War II, of course, some of the Muslim states became independent even before that, but most of the Muslim states became independent after the World War II. They had a choice to make, including Malaysia, for instance. Malaya became independent, of course, we all know, August 31st, 1957. I don't say Malaysia, I say Malaya because that's technically correct. Malaysia did not exist yet at that time. Malaysia only started a few years later when Sabah and Sarawak joined, as we know. So, so the question was, which way to go at the time of independence? And perhaps Indonesian example is a great example of that. At the time when they were deciding to proclaim in 1945, when they proclaimed independence from the Dutch, and then took about 4 years of war and struggle until 1949, the Dutch granted independence to Indonesians, there were two proposals on the table. One that won the day was by Sukarno and Hatta, right? Who basically said that Indonesia was not going to be an Islamic state and it was not going to be a secular state. It was going to be something in between. But then you had sometimes a forgotten man, Kartosuwirjo. Kartosuwirjo proclaimed Jakarta Charter, in which he said that Indonesia is or should be an Islamic state. Even though Sukarno and Hatta won the day, this idea of the Islamic State continued lingering in the, the back burner of Indonesian politics to reassert itself, in 1998 after the fall of Sukarno's government, and then Suharto government, I'm sorry, and then about 1/3 of the electorate generally votes for parties that have Islamic agenda. And so this is the same dilemma that many Muslim countries faced at the time. Most of the Muslim countries actually decided not to pursue an Islamic state, not to pursue a religious pathway. Most of them were a continuation of the colonial period. I often say that most Muslim countries have never experienced a post-colonial moment. They are still in the colonial moment, only that they are used by the native colonial elites. In other words, the elites that rule in much of the Muslim world still have the colonial mentality, except the difference is they are not the French or the British any longer. They are actually native people who have imbibed the idea of colonialism and authoritarianism and are still continuing to rule over their people in the same way. To go back now to Islamic revival provided the ideas toolbox from which the revivalists could draw on to both critique the developmentalist state in the Muslim world, basically to say you are too secular, you are not following Islam, you're denying the rightful place for Islam and Muslims in the society. And second, so it's a critique, but it's also an alternative. It wasn't just a critique, but they were saying, and here is what we would like to do. From the 1950s on, there's been a lot of debate around these concepts. You go back to the famous, was it Muhammad Hassan Haykal who wrote, Min Huna Nabda? From here we start. And then Muhammad Al-Ghazali, he provided a repose to that by saying, Min Huna Na'lam. And from here we know. So, Min Huna Na'lam. So this is a debate between a secular and a more Islamic kind of way of thinking. And this is really what happened in many, if not most Muslim countries during that time. Islamic revival was a way to critique that state that emerged in the post-colonial period. Again, with the caveat that I don't really believe that we are in post-colonial period yet. We are still colonized in our way of thinking, in our way of society management. Everything is pretty much in line with the colonial mentality. And then, of course, there is the provision of the alternative. So what is Islamic revival? Just a brief definition so that we know what we are talking about. Islamic revival is a broad social phenomenon which includes all those social and political actors whose aim it is to reestablish and reinstitute Islamic teachings in their broadest sense into the societies in which they live. Sometimes it's called Islamic resurgence. In Arabic literature, you have, for instance, the term sahwa, the awakening, and so on. So many of these different terms have been used to describe pretty much the same phenomenon. I've already mentioned that Islamic revival and modernity have been in constant conversation. But when it comes to modernity, it is sometimes assumed that there is a single modernity that emerged in Europe, from 16th, 17th century onward. in reality, many scholars have argued that we cannot talk really about single modernity. We can only talk about multiple modernities. So a single modernity is the type of approach that is best exemplified by the people like Francis Fukuyama in his The End of History and The Last Man, or even somebody like late Samuel Huntington in his Clash of Civilization, where basically they said that the only way to be modern is to be Western, democratic, and liberal. However, many other modern political and social programs existed in the past, including a Marxist modernist program, Japanese, Latin American, Muslim, etc. Each of them had its own version of modernity that did not necessarily imply that it had to be Western, democratic, and liberal. We know that, for instance, Marxist communist modernity, and they were very modern, was neither democratic nor liberal. And so this is best described by Shmuel Eisenstadt, who had written a number of books on multiple modernities. And I like this quote from one of his works, where he says that the idea of multiple modernities presumes that the best way to understand the contemporary world, indeed to explain the history of modernity, is to see it as a story of continual constitution and reconstitution of a multiplicity of cultural programs. These ongoing reconstructions of multiple institutional and ideological patterns are carried forward by specific social actors in close connection with social, political, and intellectual activists, and also by social movements pursuing different programs of modernity, holding very different views on what makes societies modern. So in many ways, this also describes the work of many of the Islamic movements, of many of social actors that have acted in the name of Islamic revival, who have presented a very different idea of what a modern society should look like. And so this also provides a methodology for the study of these societies, because by studying these specific social actors and social movements, you can understand what type of modernity or revival they were trying to promote. So when it comes to Islamic revival and modernity, one of the things that stands out in modern times is the rise of social movements and organized Islamic work. This is not to say that organized Islamic work did not exist in pre-modern times. However, it was in modern times, especially from the 20th century onward, that we find a very specific way of organized Islamic work that gave rise to social movements. And interestingly enough, some of the earliest, if not earliest, such movements appeared here in Southeast Asia. If you look back at Tariqat Islam, if you look back at Muhammadiyah and Nahdat al-Ulama, they all have emerged before, for instance, the quintessential social movement of the Middle East, the Muslim Brothers, Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimun, which were formed in 1928. Muhammadiyah was formed in 1912. And or Nahdat Ulama was formed in 1926, both of which before the Muslim Brothers. Of course, the Muslim Brothers was not the first Islamic movement, not even in Egypt. They were precursors to them. But they are often understood to be this quintessential Islamic movement that started it all. And I think we need to relook at that history and find, for instance, in this part of the world, find many of the similar movements that have appeared in history actually prior to many of the movements in the modern Middle East. And the rise of social movements and organized Islamic work is closely tied to a well-known verse that is often quoted. I call it the late night chai verse, because usually when Muslims sit at night and they drink a lot of chai, somebody at some point in the course of the discussion is going to say, yeah, Inna Allah la yughayyiru ma biqawmin hatta yughayyiru ma bi anfusihim. Allah will not change conditions of the people until they change what is in themselves. So this verse, as actually Naqib al-Atas like to point out, in modern times it understood in completely opposite way than it was understood traditionally. Now, I'm not suggesting that it is wrong to understand it that way, but I think it's important to understand that it was understood in a complete opposite way as compared to how it was understood traditionally. Traditionally, this verse was understood in the light of another verse in Surah Al-Anfal, where Allah Ta'ala says, ذلك بأن الله لم يكن مغيرا نعمة أنعمها على قوم حتى يغيروا ما بأنفسهم. And this is so, for Allah never changed the ni'mah, the blessing that He has bestowed upon people until they changed what was in themselves. So here note that in Surah Al-Anfal, the change is from good to bad. You are changing from ni'mah to the absence of ni'mah. The problem, though, in the 20th century is that the Muslims in general found themselves in the absence of ni'mah. They've said, we used to be great, and now we're not. We used to rule the world, now we are colonized, we are ruled over. The most famous example, I think, is in Muhammad Iqbal's Shikwa wa Jawab Shikwa, one of his most famous poems that many from the Indian subcontinent would know about. If you haven't read Shikwa, you need to, because it's a phenomenal piece of work. I cannot read it in the original language, so I have to read the English translation, unfortunately, but I sometimes go on YouTube and I listen to it in Urdu. And there's a version, particularly musical version by Sabri Brothers, that I like to listen to from time to time because it has subtitles in English. And of course, there are other examples of such literature. The famous essay by Shakib Arslan, لماذا تأخر المسلمون وتقدم غيرهم? Why have Muslims declined while others have progressed? Which, of course, was published in El Menar. It was a query, but that was sent actually from Borneo, from Indonesia, to Rashid Rida, with a request that Shakib Arslan writes an answer to this. And he wrote this famous essay that then was published as a standalone book and is read until today. And there are many such examples. And in each of these, the idea is that Muslims today are in a really difficult situation. And so it's not anymore that the verse from Surah Al-Anfal applies, which is the movement from ni'mah to the absence of ni'mah. Now we have the opposite movement. We have to move from the absence of ni'mah to ni'mah. And that is why 1311, Inna Allah la yughayyiru ma biqawmin, became a kind of a cry call for restoration of the glory of the Muslim world, if you will, and for the rise of social movements. And that is why 1311 then was interpreted in a completely opposite way in which 854 suggested it. And I think this is really important to understand. So much so that, for instance, in Bosnia, we have these Islamic newspapers that have been published since the early 1970s. And it's called Preporod, which means revival or renaissance. And the mass of the newspapers until today, you'll find in the corner this verse, Inna Allah la yughayyiru ma biqawmin. So this is what I'm trying to suggest, is that the way how modernity changed even some understandings among the Muslims of how history moves. Because in the past, Muslims were always on the winning side of history. Yes, there were downs, but overall, the movement was always understood to be greater and greater glory for the Muslims, until it wasn't. And we needed to explain it to ourselves. And Islamic revival of the 20th century was an attempt to do that. So Islamic revival and modernity, in my view, have gone through a joint evolution. So if we examine the period after the World War II, from the late 1940s or early 1950s, all the way until present, I think we can distinguish three different phases. The first phase is the modernization development phase from about late 40s, early 50s of the last century to about the beginning of the 1980s. Then we have the democratization phase, what I call democratization phase from 1980s to 2000, and then the civic engagement and citizenship phase from the early 2000s until today. I'm just going to briefly go through each of these. So in the modernization development phase, you have the rise of modern Muslim thinkers that did a number of things. First, they debated the main ideologies of the day: capitalism, communism, socialism, racism. So you have, Sayyid Qutb writing on, for instance, Al-Adalat al-Ijtima'iyya fil Islam, social justice in Islam. Or another of his works that is not often mentioned, Ma'arakatu Bayn al-Islam wa Rasmaliyya, battle between Islam and capitalism. You have Mustafa Sibai, for instance, writing about Ishtirakiyat al-Islam, the socialism of Islam. You have Ali Izetbegovic, a famous Bosnian thinker, later on president of Bosnia, writing on Islam between East and West and so on. And you have Malcolm X, who was debating racism and racial state in the United States and so on. They were also engaging the developmentalist state in Muslim societies. Here in Southeast Asia, two prominent examples are Muhammad Nasir. I'm not talking about a singer from Singapore. I'm talking about, how many of you have actually heard of Muhammad Nasir, the famous Indonesian thinker? How many of you? In the younger generation, probably not many. If you read Bahasa, his essays are compiled in compilations called Capita Selecta. And phenomenal essays, even when you read them today. For instance, I like to quote this one part where he says that socialism promises equality of all human beings, but then in the name of that equality, it impedes individual freedom. Capitalism, on the other hand, promotes individual freedom, but it represses humans, and it exploits the natural world to the point that it destroys the natural world. And he wrote this 60, 70 years ago. So these are very prescient thinkers who wrote things that came to be true. And of course, you have Anwar Ibrahim challenging in the 1970s the developmentalist state in Malaysia, and many, many others. I chose these two examples, but you can think of many, many others. Then they were also developing the idea of the Islamic State long before the I can use this word, bastardized version of the Islamic State that was promoted by ISIS or ISIL. People actually wrote about the Islamic State, and you have Maududi famously in Islamic Law and Constitution, then later on Muhammad Asad, Principles of State and Government in Islam, published in 1960, right, where he proposed here outlines for the Islamic State. And then they were also proposing alternative models of development. They were saying that the Islamic model of development should neither be socialist or communist, nor capitalist. It should be something different. I would say that this particular phase culminated with the Iranian Revolution. Why did I call it modernization development? Because this was the main theory of development in international circles in post-World War II period. And modernization theory was based and closely related to secularization thesis, which basically proposed that as societies become more modern, they would become more secular. And as they become more secular, religion is going to assume lesser and lesser importance in the society, so much so that in some aspects of secularization thesis, religion was to completely disappear, right? I think for those of us who are a little older, we know that when we studied social studies, I remember in socialist Yugoslavia, this is what was taught in schools, that religion is going to basically disappear one day. It's going to be replaced by scientific thinking, by secular thinking, and so on and so forth. And so Islamic revival then came as a complete blow to modernization development theory. And I think the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979 was really what sort of put a nail in the coffin of that theory. Because until then, the understanding was all countries are modernizing. As they become modernized, they will become secular. As they become secular, religion is going to completely disappear, or maybe it will remain within the confines of the four walls of people's homes. And then the Iranian Revolution said, not today. And it is for this reason that I think Iran became a pariah in international politics. Not so much because of what is often said state support for terrorism, because there are so many states that support terrorism as we see today. There are states that have done much, much worse than Iran. And there are states that have violated international laws in much more violent form than Iran ever did. Iran's sin, if you want to put it that way, in international politics was that it had the audacity to say, we're going to change the course of history. It's not going to be a secular, modern form of history, but we're going to bring religion back in. And that's something for which Iran is not forgiven until today in international politics, because it is one example that basically falsifies modernization development theory. Throughout this period, Islamic revivalists and modernity were in constant conversation. You can see that in the books that they wrote, like I said, debating communism and socialism and capitalism and all of these different ideas, until in the 80s, a shift happened, where you see that democracy became the main currency in international development. So international organizations from the mid-1970s started moving away from modernization development theory, and they started looking much more into democracy and democratization and human rights. And what do you know? Islamic revivalists very soon start writing on these topics, which clearly points that they were in constant conversation with modernity. So from the 70s and especially in the 80s, you start seeing books such as Al-Islam wa Demokratiya, Islam and democracy, Islam wa Huquq al-Insan, Islam and human rights, Huquq al-Mar'a fi al-Islam, rights of women in Islam, حقوق غير المسلمين في المجتمعات المسلمة, the rights of non-Muslims in Muslim societies, and so on. This again shows the way in which international discourse impacted the thinking within Islamic revival. This was also the time where we see the institutionalization of Islamic revival through things such as Islamic banking and finance. You'll see the emergence of Islamic banks and finance institution. Bank Islam here in Malaysia was established when? 1982 or 3 or 4, something like that. You have Islamic universities being established, including the one that we're sitting at, and many other such institutions. And these were fruits of the Islamic revival in many ways. This is what Islamic revival is called for, that we need to institutionalize Islamic teachings in modern institutions, whether it be finance, banking, and so on, which again clearly points to the fact that Islamic revival is a modern phenomenon. And so this goes for about a couple of decades. And then I think by the beginning of the 21st century, something happens that shifts the gear, some of which, again, is related to international discourse, but also with 9/11 and the so-called global war and terror. All of a sudden, there is a shift in Islamic revival language. So much so that now people started talking about civic engagement and citizenship. And this is where we see turning theory into practice. People talk about Muslim civil society, Madani, right? we are living it. This is one of the few remnants here in Malaysia of this particular thing, because anywhere else in the world, this has pretty much died out. Later on, of course, after the Arab Spring, you will have proposals, and even including in Egypt, you had a constitution which says that even the Muslim Brothers proposed a constitution that said that they advocate for a dawla al-madaniyya bil-marji'iyya al-islamiyya, right? They want a civil state with Islamic reference, if you will. And this is where the whole idea of Madaniya or Madani and civil society. Now, of course, if you go to the 90s, you see that. If you can, I don't know if in the library, I think there is in IIUM library a video, an interview with Anwar Ibrahim from 1994, 5, 6, in which he talks about civil society in Islam and so on. Find it in the library and watch it. It's an interesting video to watch now and try and compare it to the discourse that is now and the discourse back then. And it's true, there's not much difference. One thing, and I would just put this as a footnote, because I've studied him quite a bit and I wrote about this in my dissertation, that Anwar Ibrahim has actually shown a great consistency in his ideas and thinking. From the 1970s all the way up until today, for the last almost 50 years. When I was doing research for my dissertation, I went at the University of Malaya. There is a special collection called the Zaba collection. Of course, the famous Zaba, the Malay thinker. The Zaba collection had papers written and presented by Anwar Ibrahim when he was in ABIM, and then later on when he joined the government. And if you look at that, and I did look into that. Now, when I was doing my research, you couldn't, because this was a special collection, you couldn't copy those papers, and there were no cameras back then. So I basically had to take notes. And you'll find that many of the things that he is talking about today are the same things that he's consistently been pushing for the past 30 or 40 years, which is quite interesting. And one of them is this idea of civil societies or Madani. This is not something new. Also part of this civic engagement citizenship phase is the emergence of the questioning of the Dar al-Harb versus Dar al-Islam dichotomy in Islamic international relations, the emergence of Maqasid al-Sharia discourse, and then fiqh al-muwatana, fiqh of citizenship, the fruition of Islamic political parties in many places, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, and in some other places where they were allowed to, not many places allowed Islamic political parties, and when they did, they would often shut them down. Algeria is one example. Tunisia, most recently, Egypt, obviously, and many, many others. And then, of course, the emergence of other issues in Islamic thought, such as gender issues. You have Amina Wadud popularizing the idea of, you know, what eventually she called the gender jihad. She has a book on that, and so on. So this civic engagement citizenship phase is what we're living today. But I would argue, as I did from the beginning, that this is sort of at its end, and there are very few remnants of this thinking. Malaysia is one of them, but there are not many countries where this thinking is prevailing any longer. Part of it has to do with the oppressive nature of most Muslim states that do not allow this kind of thinking, where many of people who have promoted this kind of thinking are in jail, like Rashid al-Ghanouchi, or sometimes people self-sabotage, like Tariq Ramadan, you know. But his ideas are very relevant for this period that we're talking in. This is the time when he was writing his books on European Islam, on radical reform, and many others that are part of this milieu in which this was discussed. So that's how we got here. And so because this way of thinking is on the way out in many ways, like I said, Malaysia is an exception. It's still continuing. We'll see for how long. But most other countries have lost. You know, if you look at Egypt, the Muslim Brothers, obviously one of the main proponents of this thinking, are completely decimated, right? Completely decimated. So what are the morbid symptoms that, you know, Gramsci talked about? Well, here is one of them. Remember when the late Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi, rahmatullah alayh, and Mohammed bin Bayya used to be together? Well, it's a memory now. They're not together any longer. They're actually on the opposite side. Of course, Sheikh Qaradawi has passed away, but I'm talking about the ideas, right? that emerged, especially after the Arab Spring, which is the contestation between neo-traditionalist Sufi approaches, interestingly supported by the Saudis, the Emiratis, and Egypt, on the one hand, and then modernist, reformist, revivalist approaches to Islam, promoted by Qatar, Turkey until recently, and then I would say Malaysia again after Anwar became prime minister in many ways. So Sheikh Qaradawi and Sheikh bin Baya were together in the International Union of Muslim Scholars. Sheikh Qaradawi was the president, or the leading person. Sheikh bin Baya was his deputy. After the Arab Spring, they split apart. Bin Baya aligned himself with the Emiratis. Qaradawi stayed in Qatar and stayed within the Muslim Brothers orbit, if you will. And that's a morbid symptom. People who were previously together, who worked together, who shared ideas. Like, for instance, one of the big ideas of Sheikh bin Baya is fiqh al-waqi', which is really Sheikh Qaradawi's idea, right? And until today, he promotes that. But somehow, politically, they cannot see eye to eye any longer. What are some other morbid symptoms? Well, rise of militancy, ISIS, ISIL, and many of these things. Regardless of what we think and know about them, whether they've been created by secret services, agencies, Mossad, and so on, and I'm sure all of them had a role in the creation of ISIS and so on, it's still a morbid symptom where you find people killing each other, Muslims killing each other, people from the same countries killing each other, civil wars, ethnic strife, and so on. What are some other morbid symptoms that we see during this time? And especially, I think this has become clear after the Arab Spring. Let's take some of the beloved texts that we study in Kalam or Aqidah. This is, well, I'll read this and I'll ask you where this is from. Some of you might know. So here is what one of the standard texts in Kalam says. I'll put my glasses on so I can read better. ولا نرى الخروج على أئمتنا وولاة أمورنا وإن جاروا ولا ندعو عليهم ولا ننزع يدا من طاعتهم ونرى طاعتهم من طاعة الله عز وجل فريضة ما لم يأمروا بمعصية وندعو لهم بالصلاح والمعافاة. Where is this from? Here is, for those of you, if you don't understand Arabic, here is the translation. It says, we do not rebel against our leaders or those in charge of our affairs, even if they are tyrannical. Now, in jaru could be tyrannical, unjust, you can translate in different ways. We do not supplicate against them, nor withdraw from obedience to them. We view obedience to them as obedience to Allah Almighty, an obligation, faridatan. As long as they do not order disobedience to Allah, we supplicate on their behalf for righteousness and wellness. Where is this from? Does anybody know? 1, 2, 3, done. Your name?
This is most of the Salafi groups, Wahhabi groups, they have this.
This is not Salafi. This is a mainstream Sunni creed. This is Aqidah Tahawiyah. And you'll find this in most books of Kalam. Fine. But how is this relevant for modern times and nation state we live in? How is this relevant for a democratic society like Malaysia, for instance? What does it mean not rebelling against our leaders? What does it mean if you're in the opposition? You have somebody like Hamza Yusuf, for instance, coming to Malaysia about 10 years ago, I remember, just before an election. And he said, you need to vote for the government. Don't vote for the opposition. Because it's part of our Sunni creed that we don't go against the government, no matter how bad it is. So even if they steal 100 million ringgit, 100 billion ringgit, we don't go against them. And then when you get younger generation reading this and they see what's going on, do you think they're going to still consider themselves belonging to the Sunni school of thought? It's going to be really challenging. And these are tensions that these morbid symptoms that we are seeing today are exemplifying. Now, in Aqidah Tahawiyya, the same texts, you just go a few lines down, and this is what you find. It says, وَنُحِبُّ أَهْلَ الْعَدْلِ وَالْأَمَانَةِ حُبُّ أَهْلِ الْعَدْلِ مِنْ كَمَالِ الْإِيمَانِ وَنُبْغِضُ أَهْلَ الْجَوْرِ وَالْخِيَانَةِ. He said, we love the people of justice and trustworthiness, for love of the people of justice is among the perfection of faith. We hate the people of injustice and treachery. So we're going to obey them and make dua for them, but we're going to hate them and love the people of justice, but we're not going to support them. And if this is not some kind of convoluted thinking, then I don't know what it is. Now, I understand the political situation under which these texts were written and why they were written, because, you know, of Al-Khawarij, you know, the consultations between the Sunni and the Shia, the rise of the Mamluk dynasties, you know, how do we make our Khalifa still being legitimate if he doesn't have a power, because the Shawka is now with the, you know, with the military and so on. So these texts were created to account for that reality. The problem, especially in a lot of traditionalist and neo-traditionalist circles, is that they teach these texts as if they are munazzal min as-sama, as if they were given and descended from the heavens, without understanding the historical conditions under which they were written. And so they, until today, like I said, they come and say, well, here is what you need to do because that's what a proper Sunni Muslim should do. I think that is a tension there. I think it's a tension there to say we're going to support the unjust government, but we're going to love just people. We're going to pray for the unjust government, but we're going to hate it. Because basically that's what it says here. You know, injar says if they commit injustice, but then it says, وَنُبْغِضُ أَهْلَ الْجَوْرِ. So this is a clear tension. It was a way in which the scholars back then, when this was written more than 1,000 years ago, by the way, accounted for the reality that they were in. But how is this going to help us account for the reality that we are in? That is a big question we have to ask ourselves. And I think we need to start being very critical and self-critical to think about ways out of the situations that we had created. Because until today, you still have a lot of ulama who are going to cling to these texts in order to say that someone like Sisi is completely fine. That someone like, I don't know, Bouteflika or, you know, who else is completely fine because they are the government and we should obey the government. And that's it, end of story. I think we need to be a little bit more sophisticated in that today, because the reality that we have today is a different reality than people lived more than 1,000 years ago. And our books of Kalam had not been updated for this reality at all. We still teach Aqidah Tahawiyya as if it is describing our reality today. And it is not. It was written for different reality. So, this is what Zia Sardar would say, welcome to post-normal times. This is the time when we have to rethink many of the ideas that we have. And I like this one sentence that he wrote. I mean, I like this thing in general, but he said, this last sentence where he said, we will have to imagine ourselves out of post-normal times and into a new age of normalcy. We have to imagine ourselves out of post-normal times. So the power of imagination, and we have to ask ourselves, do we as Muslims possess today the power of imagination? Do we have the power of imagination to imagine a reality that is different than the one that we are living in? The one in which Muslims are not slaughtered left and right, kept in concentration camps, constantly being subjugated by tyrannical government that are supported by external forces. Can we imagine a different future for ourselves? And I think we need to. And it begins with us and begins with thinking about Islamic thought, number one, in a critical fashion, and number two, in a creative fashion so that we can get out of the predicament that we're in. So I told you about the story, and I'm coming to an end of this, of how we got to where we are today. How this latest wave of Islamic revival provided many answers, but also opened up new lines of inquiry for which the answers are not provided yet. So how about today? You know, if when I was a student in the 1990s here at IIUM, and you ask me, what am I reading? I would say, you know, I'm reading a little bit of Malik bin Nabi and a little bit of Sayyid Qutb and a little bit of, I don't know, you know, what we read, Doctor, back then. Ibn Khaldun and Shatibi and all of these things, right? Okay, very good. But I'm talking more about people who are kind of contemporaries, you know, not so people like Ali Izetbegovic, like, you know, good. How about today? What are we reading today? And who's writing those books? And I know if I go around and ask you, you will either say I'm reading the classics or I'm reading this generation. But how about the current generation? And that is where the interregnum is. There isn't really much. We have a lot of, if you go on YouTube, we have a lot of influencers, we have a lot of celebrity shuyukh, we had tons of lectures. You can spend all of your life just listening to the lectures on YouTubes. I'm talking about Islamic thought. I'm not talking about celebrity lecturers. I'm not talking about feel-good Islam, you know, type of thing, chirama and or something like that. I'm talking about real deep. Any bright ideas today? Who are the thought leaders of today? What is the dominant discourse of today? I don't know if I have the answer, but these are the questions we need to ask. And if there isn't one, we better create it. And I think this is the role of the institutions like ISTAC, is to address this interregnum that we're in, this lull. So here are some ideas, just to sort of jumpstart our thinking. I think we need to take stock of what happened, where we are now before we deliberate on where we're headed. The interregnum that we're in is the time of uncertainty, but it's also a time of opportunity. What we do today and what we do now will directly impact Islamic thought for decades to come. We need to be bold and ask difficult questions. But most of all, I think we need to be open-minded and tolerant toward making mistakes. You see, one of the unfortunate products of Islamic revival in the 20th century is this idea that we all should be perfect Muslims who make no mistakes. And if we do, then we're going to point fingers and say, why did you do this? A good Muslim would never do that. How bad are you? And the problem with that is that people then, what do they do in order to avoid being critiqued and criticized? Because most people cannot take being critiqued. Most people do not have enough confidence to say, this is what I believe, I don't care what you, if you critique me, that's fine, but it's not going to impact me. Most people are not like that. So what do people do to avoid criticism? You go back to what sort of everybody agrees on, because that you know is going to shield you from criticism. So I can go back to Aqidah Tahawiyya and say this text has been around 1,000 years, it's been taught in madrasas all over the Muslim world. I'm just going to repeat it. There's no way you can critique me because I have 1,000 years of tradition to defend me against critique. But if I'm going to attempt something new, then you're going to say, but you made a mistake. And if I make a mistake, all of a sudden, I'm a bad Muslim. If I'm a bad Muslim, I'm a bad person. If I'm a bad person, I shouldn't be associated with. So I'm written off. I think we need to allow each other to make mistakes. I'm telling you, if the great A'imma were alive today, they would be critiqued by people who think that they are so pious among us. You know, Imam Abu Hanifa would be accused of not being Hanafi enough, because the Hanafi madhab was, as many of you know, only consolidated after his death. So if he were alive and presented the idea that he had, even the Hanafis would say, "Or not, you're not a good Hanafi," even though the school carries his name. People have made ijtihadat in the past, some of which are really weird. We don't consider necessarily that just because they are weird, or maybe they were even mistaken that these great A'imma were bad Muslims. But today we're not allowed to make mistakes any longer. I think the only way to move forward is if you are bold enough and try, and when you make mistake, you correct it. But in order to do that, we have to be there to support each other so that when we make mistakes, we do not jump on people and put them under our feet and trample on them, but we point it out to them and let them try and correct themselves. Because the only way we can forward Islamic thought is by being bold. And when you are bold, you're bound to make mistakes. But making mistakes is not the same as being a bad Muslim. We all make mistakes. We all can have ideas that maybe would be proven incorrect over time. Does that mean I was a bad Muslim just because I had some bad idea from time to time, or idea that was proven wrong? But somehow we have created this kind of game where we try to out-piety one another. I think we need to sort of rethink that. And no new development in Islamic thought will take place without courage. And courage is something that that oftentimes is lacking when there is too much of groupthink and institutional thinking. So I think if you ask me what we need to do in order to develop Islamic thought would be to develop Muslims who are resilient, courageous, who are well aware of our tradition and are respectful of it without necessarily sacralizing it. In neo-traditionalist circles, they like to talk often about the sacred sciences. And I don't know where that term came from. I haven't studied this. But if you were to translate sacred sciences back in Arabic, what would you say? How would you translate sacred sciences?
Something to
العلوم الإلهية والمقدسة or something. But this kind of terminology never existed in Arabic language in Islam, right? We don't call al-ulum al-muqaddasa or al-ulum. What's that?
It cannot be
Direct translation. So I think we need to, again, what I'm trying to say here is that we need to respect our tradition without necessarily sacralizing it. We have to revive it without necessarily repeating it. And that is very difficult because the easiest thing to do for human beings, this is what we do. This is probably, you know, if I were an evolutionary biologist, and I'm not, but if I were, I would say this is the monkey or the ape part of us, mimicry. You know, how babies, how we learn when we are little, we imitate. The easiest thing to do in the world is to imitate. You know that famous statement, monkey sees, monkey does, right? So, you know, that's monkey business right there, a form of taqlid, if you will. In order to get out of that monkey business, you have to be open-minded and bold, and to move beyond mimicry and imitation into something that is more creative, higher level of thinking. This is what separates humans from apes. We have allowed ourselves for too long to adopt imitative solutions. And I think we need to liberate ourselves from that thinking in order to move forward. And that's going to take a lot. That's going to take a lot. And it needs a community of people that are going to support one another. So I see places like ISTAC as places where that kind of support can be established, where you can say, yes, we are attempting something new and bold and creative. We are not trying to imitate. We're trying to creatively revive the tradition. And even if people outside may feel that there is something weird going on, I think with the support system that you can establish of one another, you can come up with some new great bold ideas. Bring yourself always to the past when our great scholars produced their great works. if they imitated what came before them, they would never have produced them. Imam Shafi'i would never write a Risala or Kitab al-Umm. Ibn Khaldun would never write al-Muqaddimah if he just imitated what people wrote before him. Imam Shatibi would not write al-Muwafaqat. Right? And so on and so forth. You can name your examples. They, of course, had the benefit of not having social media around them, because if they did, I'm sure there'll be a lot of people like tweeting, man, that Ibn Khaldun is so weird. I don't know what he's writing about. You know, what is Imam Shafi'i doing? Like, the methodology, what he's saying that hikmah is the sunnah and we now have to base everything on the hadith. What is that thing? People don't really do this, That's so weird. LOL, Shafi'i, those kind of things. But they were brave. And that's why we read their books until today, because they were different. They were new. They were creative. So we have to ask ourselves, how do we, at this time of what I call the Great Interregnum, be bold and creative and different, while at the same time retaining the essence and the core of what makes us Muslims and of our principles? That's what they did in the past, and that's what we can do today. But something needs to change. We cannot do it under the same conditions that led us to the interregnum that we're in. So I'll leave you with these questions, and hopefully we can have a few minutes for the discussion. So what are your thoughts? Where is Islamic discourse heading today? Who are the main carriers of this discourse? Where from are we to expect change? And where to begin? I think these are the good questions to ask ourselves. And if we could provide some creative answers to them, that would be a first step. I see the students here as having this tremendous opportunity now. You are deciding on writing your thesis and dissertations. You can ask bold questions and try to give answers to them. You don't have to be correct in everything, but you can boldly examine what happened, what is happening, and where we should be heading. So you have the benefit that you don't have a legacy to protect. When you're an established scholar, you have a legacy, and people are going to hold you to account to that legacy. But when you're about to establish yourself, nobody cares about you, which means you have full freedom to say whatever it is that you're going to say. In many ways that somebody who is established often cannot. And this is not a takedown of any of us who may be a little bit more established. It's just to recognize that being young and and writing your dissertation is really a great time to be bold and innovative in your thinking. Because the longer you go with that career, less bold and less creative you're going to get. Believe me when I say this. So with that being said, here are the questions in front of us. That was what I had to share with you. I'd like to hear from you, your thoughts, your ideas, your questions. I cannot stay too long because I have another engagement at 5 o'clock and I have to get there by 5. So I probably would have to leave in about maximum half an hour. I know that this goes until 4 o'clock officially. So if you feel we need to finish at 4, fine by me. If we can stay until about 4:15, that's also fine by me. I think as far as our meeting is concerned, we already have an agreement. So that was the shortest meeting in the history of the IIUM, I believe. And thank you so much. Jazakumullah khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. ERMIN. So maybe we can open to questions. Yeah.
Just,
Yeah, I mean, Prof. want to add. Oh, sorry.
No, I just being practical. Right? So you are now executive director of CICW. So now you raise these various issues here. So I'm sure you have been raising these issues also with your colleagues, others in America. Now you are bringing, maybe you are bringing those issues now here to ISTAC. And you want us to discuss this. My question, out of so many issues that you raise here, which one is uppermost in your mind in terms of approach, in terms of what you need to you know to deal with, issues to address because there are different issues, but they are related, no doubt. Yeah, but what are the outstanding issues there that perhaps we should share with the other institutes, you know, not just ISTAC, but the others, and hopefully, I'm thinking maybe we need to identify some fundamental issues that are important for all of us. Maybe we need to have a big event, something like what we did nearly 50 years ago, that the Makkah conference. The Makkah conference is a good thing, you know, and in other words for us, that is revisit. I didn't go, but I was keeping, I was following very closely. So that was 50 years ago, nearly 50 years ago. Yeah, that was 1977. So this 2027 will be 50 years. Now, yes, it is a great question. Even like for example, this university, because this university was implementing the resolutions of that thing, the Islamization of knowledge, which I think we should mention that it has run its course. Certainly, I mean, it has no stamina. It's not going anywhere, no? So I think perhaps can you be a little bit more in terms of, is this very much in your mind with your colleagues there? And then maybe we can discuss further with ISTAC or with the IIUM, with the other colleagues. When? Because I don't want ideas are being just thrown around, but what is it from your point of view?
Yeah. No, that's really a great point, Professor Osman, because this is exactly where we need to take our thinking. I think this is the time, you see, even the idea of graduate education, postgraduate education that we have, we've taken that model from the German postgraduate education, where you have an individual student working with a mentor on a topic that is of interest to students. I think for us Muslims, we need to be more strategic at that, as opposed, not let every student choose whatever topic, but we should actually have certain priorities defined and say, here is where ISTAC wants to make a difference. So if you come as a student to ISTAC, here are certain, we don't tell you the exact topic you write down, but there should be some strategic areas that if you're coming as a student at ISTAC, that you should choose from and then write within that field. Because you know what, we don't need another dissertation on Ibn Hajar's, conditions of thiqah in Fath al-Bari, for instance. We don't need another dissertation on that. We need to be a little bit more strategic. We need to define those. So I'll give you a few things, because political science has always been my field of specialization, issues of authoritarianism and dictatorship. When Abdurrahman al-Kawakibi wrote his famous Taba' al-Istibdad, Nature of Despotism, 120, 30 years ago, we haven't had many works of that kind, even though Muslims have known more despotism and tyranny than probably anybody else. We need to have a discourse on understanding how authoritarianism emerged, what facilitates it, how does it prolong itself, and most importantly, how do we end it? There should be a research program on that. Another aspect of political science, the civil-military relations. Muslim world has suffered from military coups and military dictatorships in the past 50, 100 years. Again, probably more, almost more than most other countries. You know, you had the Praetorian regimes, and then you had, in Latin America, they had problem with that too. So why is it that we in the Muslim world have these military coups and militaries taking power in Algeria, in Egypt, in Sudan, in many other places? What facilitates it? What is it in our thought that makes it easier for a military to take over power? And I'm sure if we examine it, we would find it. I do have some tentative, like for instance, حكم تغلب. I think it was Ibn Jama'ah who famously stated, نحن مع من غلبة. We, meaning the jurists, are with those who militarily prevail. In other words, whoever militarily wins power, we're going to bestow legitimacy upon them. And you could say, well, that's how most governments come to power in history. But there is a difference between that and between the fact that when you bestow legitimacy upon it, you're basically seeing that seizing power by force and violence by an organized militant group is an acceptable way of doing things, you know, which is exactly what ISIS tried to do. And they would say, well, this is what the Sunni thought tells us, you know, as long as you do it militarily, you take over power, you become legitimate leader, the ulama give you bay'ah, and khalas, that's it. I think we have to re-examine that, you know. The civil society and the power of civil society. So that's, for instance, in the areas of political science. There are certain issues and priorities that I think we can research. When it comes to the issue of kalam or issue of Islam and science or something like that, there would be some priority issues, questions that are of extreme importance for Muslims, because these questions are really impacting our day-to-day being as Muslims. So, you know, look at the issue of good governance. Why is it that we have so many Muslims who pray 5 times a day, fast in Ramadan, go to Hajj, and find nothing wrong to take bribery? Where is the disconnect? I think we need to study that. We need to find out why is it in our approach to religion that you can have a beard and hijab and pray 5 times a day, and you don't think there's anything wrong if you award 20 million contract to somebody just because they are closely related to you and you have a better bit on the table. So that's the kind of thing that I think we need to study. And that would be in behavior, in psychology, in sociology. What are the factors and where can we break that in our education system to create people that are going to think, you know, if I am a Muslim and I pray 5 times a day, there is no way I can give or receive bribery no matter what. There is no way I can favor a person just because they are related to me when there is someone more capable of assuming a certain position. So you can go on and on and on and on, but this would be, I think, institutions like ISTAC are best positioned. You know, CICW is not a research or academic institution the way that ISTAC is. I mean, we are a small institution that have few areas of focus. And alhamdulillah, you're right. Within a short period of time, we've been able to achieve quite a bit. We have good board of trustees, a small team that is very capable, hardworking, and that's great. But institutions like ISTAC, because you have postgraduate students and masters and PhDs, we are in the position here to create a research program with these priorities to address the real problems facing Muslims today. And so these are some examples. I think we can, thinking along these lines, we can find many others where we could produce 10 dissertations on each of these topics. And if out of 10 of those, you get 2 or 3 really good ones, that's a really good outcome. And then out of those, you can say, well, here are the conditions under which authoritarianism emerge. Here is how the authoritarians prolong their rule. And here is how we can break that. And here how we can, as the ummah, reclaim the power that has been given to us by Allah Ta'ala when he called us ummatan wasata, when he called us as the Ummah, which amrahum shura bainahum, and so on and so forth. This is the Ummah that the Quran is aspiring for. And it's the Ummah that is potentially there, but we have to discover it. And so it starts with ideas, it starts with thought. And ideas start with, I think, a good research program that can help us address those priorities. So I'm absolutely with you, Prof, on this one. We need to be practical, and I think we need to be strategic in addition to be practical. That is to say, we don't just let students in and say, okay, choose a topic and write down. No, we say, here is a list of strategic priorities, not just for ISTAC, for the Ummah. Choose one of these priorities and we'll find you the best supervisor, and you're going to produce a really good work that are going to help us understand this phenomenon and to apply then solutions to solve some of the problems that the Ummah is facing today. This is the way I would do it. This is the way how I would approach it. And I think together we can do this, inshallah. Yes.
Thank you for the enlightening discourse. Reminds me of things that I've learned in the social science and political science over the last 40, 50 years. I have a professor's degree in political science from Minnesota. I studied Daniel Lerner in the 50s, 60s. Passage of Traditional Society, very relevant to your discourse.
Yes. I put it in my paper, actually.
And religion, Islam is not an index in development. So that was a powerful, powerful work, which has influenced the discussions in the development and social science, the linearity of development. But you put it correctly that the Iranian Revolution disrupted. It disrupted that linearity. But there's another issue which you have directly or indirectly pointed out, the apologetic, contradictory notion of the state. We have not addressed the state as in the modern nation state or as in the Islamic state. We have been captive of the idea of the state. And therefore, we cannot put things together. We cannot, harmonize the state as what we conceive as the state in Islam and the modern nation state, because the post-Westphalian 1648 state, nation state, is not just a polity. It is a global system. It has become a global system. And when we talk about Islamic thought or Islamic state, it exists within that network of the global system. It has not extricated out of that global system. This is the problem with Muslim thinkers. They have not addressed and they have not come to terms, and Muslim scholars also. Our social scientists have not really integrated the state. We have not teased out the state. And those from Maududi, Said Qutb, Khomeini, and others, and the modern thinkers that you mentioned, have not really interrogated the state. They have not terrorized the state. So I think that this is the main problem that we are facing, that we have not seen. We do not see the black swan. We do not see the gray elephant.
I think you make really, really good points here, and I agree with everything you said. I think in this stage that we're in of Interregnum, I think Islamic thought needs to be disruptive, absolutely disruptive, of categories that are being taken for granted, whether it be nation state, whether it be global neoliberal capitalist economy. Islamic thought must be disruptive of these things. We need to disrupt. We need to disrupt Western ways of thinking. We need to question them and critique them. Like I said earlier, we need to have critical approach to our own legacy. If we're going to have critical approach to our legacy, just imagine how much more critical we should be toward legacy that is not ours, that has not been produced from within Islamic worldview. And yet, like you rightly said, we are buying into it wholesale. the idea of nation state, the idea of global economy, the idea of, so I think we need to be disruptive in every possible way of politics, economics, of the categories that had been imposed onto us by colonial thinking. We haven't even started the process of decolonizing our minds.
In the 70s and 80s, Majid Tehranian was talking about multiple modernities. Before multiple modernities became a buzzword later on. He was talking about the example of Iran. He was talking about the example of Japan. He was debunking the idea that modernity comes from the West or from colonialism. So I think that nomenclature should be revisited. I mean, at that time, the nomenclature of deconstructionism was not there yet. I think one of the things that we need to do is to deconstruct categories and epistemes so that we can move on, like what you said. And I think that Majid Tehranian was the precursor of this, without using the word.
Yeah, and of course you have Jalal Ali Ahmed as well, about Gharb Zadegi, West toxication, and so on. I think we need to revive this line of thought. If you look at the Quran presents itself as the continuation of Revelations, right? But it's at the same time also a disruptive text because it disrupts so many things in society for the sake of putting things back where they should be. It is one of the most radical texts in human history. And yet today we have adopted this idea of normalcy, and that if you are disruptive, you are somehow extreme or radical. Whereas the Quran itself is one of the most radical, and I would say extreme texts in human history, in the sense that it breaks down, deconstructs, like you said, categories. It takes the category of polytheist worship and it deconstructs it to its bare bone. It shows how, how vile it is for human beings to worship idols and so on. It deconstructs so many different ideas you can think of even the prayer itself. It deconstructs the idea of the prayers that they're offering to the idols, and then reconstructs what the true prayer should look like. Deconstructs even the Qibla in order to come with the new Qibla. It's totally disruptive in every possible way, but it's also restorative because it restores things to where they should be. And this is the greatness as we're coming onto the Hajj season of اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم وأتممت عليكم نعمتي ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا, that the completion of religion, as revealed in Surah Al-Ma'idah, after the Prophet ﷺ completed his pilgrimage, was a restoration. You know what the Prophet said? I really shiver every time I read this. And I even had an idea of writing about it, but I don't feel intellectually capable of doing it. So hopefully someone will pick up on this. When he said at Hajj, this is a most profound statement. He said, today, time has returned as it was at the time of the creation of the heavens and the earth. That is absolutely mind-blowing. Time has been restored by the act of Prophet's final pilgrimage and sacrifice. It's a restoration of time, resetting the cosmic clock. This is one of the most profound events in human history. One of the most profound events in human history, restoration of the cosmic clock. By disrupting the categories that have been introduced by the mushrikeen or people before, disrupting those and then restoring what is right. I think if we take this Quranic movement of disruption, then restoration, then we can start thinking about the future of Islamic thought. So this to me, like when I come to the Hajj season, all I can think about is this, really. how the Prophet ﷺ, by his mission, restored the cosmic clock. To me, that is, that's beyond quantum physics right there. And Prof is an expert in this field, and he can maybe elucidate more on this. I found this to be one of the most extraordinary statements in the Hadith. The idea of sacrifice, the idea of Hajj as restoration, and then after that, the Prophet ﷺ is taken because his mission is complete. It only became complete after that final piece was put in its place, and that was the restoration of the cosmic clock, of time, of space, Mecca, and everything else. It's extremely disruptive. But here is where Islam differs from deconstructionism. Deconstruction exists for its own sake, and it doesn't offer anything after that. Islam deconstructs and then restores. And this is the challenge for us as Muslims, to think in this way. So I think we have something profound in front of us, the Quran primarily, obviously. And I don't think we're utilizing what is giving us, not even one bit. Because if we did, we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in today as Muslims.
Yes. Yeah, there's one question, but Mufti Hassan wanted to, he was waiting on wait. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go on.
Assalamu alaikum.
Go on.
Yes.
Please, go on, Mufti Hassan.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum. I am from Pakistan. My name is Muhammad Hassan. Actually, today, alhamdulillah, I got a lot of knowledge and information about 21st century, how we develop Islamic revivalism. So, as I see, nowadays we are facing different kinds of colonialism, especially in my country, we are under pressure of like such IMF, and we cannot do anything, and we cannot play any role about our Muslims or Islam. So such as for Gaza or Palestine. So we cannot do anything because we are under pressure, we are under loan. So on the other hand, we have a lot of religious institutions in Pakistan, such as madrasas. So more than 50,000 madrasas in Pakistan. So they must to play a role for Islamic revivalism, but they don't do anything because some reasons. One of these religious scholars have divide in sects, different sects. And other is they don't have any big and bold thinking, just radical thinking. So my research topic is that to collect data, what is the main problems of religious scholars and madrasa graduates, why they don't do anything and play any role. So what is the idea, if you have any idea about my country, Pakistan? So please.
Thank you so much, brother, for your question. I cannot answer that question really because I think there is a number of issues there. But when you mention it, if you have 50,000 madrasas, you would think that place should be thriving, right? And in fact, it's the opposite. Yeah, go ahead.
Because thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Arman. Because I'm also from Pakistan. I'm Somali, and here I'm doing PhD. It's not only the religious madrasas. Also, we have the modern in this era the flow of information that is disrupts all the modern thinking with the modern universities. We are facing that our youth are demanding now that Pakistan should be a secular country because the madrasa and the other religious institutions, and there's the myth the myth of two nations, that it's independent Islamic countries, it's failed to be established. So we need to a secular country. It's a few days, only a couple of weeks debate in my university, and I just found this question from one young girl, that why we didn't establish this country as a secular country, because we need that modernity, that liberalism, and this all happened due to that flow of information, though, that not establish the true Islamic thought and civilization. And unfortunately, we can't show them the exact Madani state that they should visit, and this visit that Madani state as a where the Islamic thought and civilization is in practice. So what is, now you can answer about the Pakistan.
I said I cannot answer that question. I mean, I I don't think anybody can. You know, the situation in some Muslim countries, including Pakistan, is now so complex and so complicated that I think this is also a reason why so many people are leaving those countries, because they realize there's nowhere to begin any longer. You know, in Malaysia, there is still some kind of semblance of normalcy, and most other countries there isn't. Pakistan is one of them, and so you wouldn't even know where to begin any longer. So I cannot really claim to be able to answer that question. I think both of you have identified some of the major problems, but I don't think I have an answer to that, you know, because it's just too complicated right now. You're absolutely right. We're allowed ourselves to be slaves to international institutions, to the IMF. They roped us in with debt, and then they strangle noose around our neck to the point that now we don't have our own autonomy. And then on top of that, you have, you know, issues of these madrasas, militancy, and others. As a reaction to that, now you have the rising secularism. And believe me, those secularists, if they come to power, they're going to be just like those militants before them. They're going to be just like Ataturk, you know. They're going to impose authoritarianism in the name of secularism. So it's either authoritarianism in the name of religion or authoritarianism in the name of secularism. Either way, we're on the losing side. And that's why I said we need to understand this phenomenon, why this authoritarianism is recurring in Muslim societies, and how can we ultimately rectify that problem. So for that, you need a more systematic and strategic approach than simply trying to, you know, figure out an answer or two for one or two small things that are happening here and there. I thought there was
I have also a question, sir.
yeah, let me just take this question from, so that we pay attention to our audience on Zoom, and then we're going to have you, and I think that's probably going to be the end, because I'll have to leave at that moment. What do you reckon to be the good or perhaps the bad mistakes should not be making? Okay, so the question is, what are the good or bad mistakes Muslims should or should not be making in order to revive Islam? I don't think Muslims should be committing the mistake of kufr, for instance, or nifaq, hypocrisy. And we have abundance of that. But an honest mistake is something, so if you are a researcher and you're trying to study an issue, and you do your due diligence and you come out with certain ideas and you write them down, but many others figure out that that was a wrong way to do it and so on. That's the kind of mistakes I'm referring to. That doesn't make a person a bad person. If somebody offers a thought or an idea on some fiqh issue, you know, in fiqh, we have so many opinions that I don't think any opinion anyone would offer would go outside the range of the weirdness that we have witnessed in the last 1400 years, you know. So that kind of mistake is, for me, it's not, you know, somebody has a weird fiqh opinion. To me, you know, we have millions of those in history. That's just one of them. You know, the mistakes that I think we should avoid as Muslims are the mistakes of, you know, kufr, nifaq, the big things that really go to the core of altering who we are. That's what we shouldn't be doing. So I don't know if this is too general, but, you know, final and quickly, please.
Sir, my question is like where to begin and what we have to do. And do we have to rule the world? We need to specify first, or just we have to civilize as Islamic civilization? Because when we talk about Islamic civilization or power of Islamic countries, as you mentioned, Islamic countries killing each other. Now we are talking about, before we were talking about Kashmir and then Burma and then now Gaza, because there are opposition is the non-Muslim. So where Muslims killing the Muslims, no one talk about that. So where to begin? We need to unite ourselves, or we just want power. When we have power, so then we kill each other. So what we have to do?
Yes, I think we need conceptual clarity to start with. I don't think we are clear about many issues that we talk about. And that's where I think this research comes in, to have conceptual clarity, because when you have confusion at every level, that's where discord is sown, that's where people start killing each other, because everybody is claiming to be an Islamic state and this and that, because there is no clear concept of what constitutes these things. So you have to have first conceptual clarity, and then you have to have a way to implement that concept. That would be a way to begin. You know, when where confusion reigns, that's where people start making all these kind of opposing claims, leading them to violence and killing each other. I would begin there, and that comes with clear mind and clear understanding of what we're doing. And that's why I think these research priorities that Professor Osman talked about is really, really crucial in clarifying many of these concepts and making that first step toward doing what is right, including the construction and disruption of the already existing concepts, and then restoration of what the Quranic mandate for those concepts would be.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Ermin, for your insightful talk. So maybe we hand to Prof. Aziz for the conclusion.
Yeah, thank you very much. Alhamdulillah. First of all, let's thank our doctor for this very inspiring, informative, and very rich lecture. You remember last Friday, we invited Professor Jasir Auda, talking about the system thinking and how you develop your abilities and competencies of that type of thinking. Then you can understand what does mean construct and deconstruct and reconstruct, how you analyze, how you synthesize. I think that's what we are trying to do at this institute, because I think the Dr. Ermin has raised a lot of very deep questions, and also he gave good answers and indications. But in the end, strategically speaking, from the talking about revivalism, we need to understand that there are things deeper. Our crisis and our cancer is much more deeper than just relating to some political manifestations or economic manifestations. It goes deeper into our mind and into our abilities of thinking and synthesizing. And that's why the educational system of the Ummah needs to take the deep course of change, so that we will be able, maybe now or in the future, to nurture the mind, the Muslim mind, that is living here and doing ijtihad here and producing ideas here without any problem of originality, any problem of following the Quran and Sunnah and the history and heritage, but he is living here and producing ideas, solutions. That's our starting point, actually. That's why our ulama before, even the school of Islamization of knowledge, Malik bin Nabi before, Al-Ghanouchi and all these people, they talk about this problem of the Muslim mind. When we start partializing things, we are unable to connect things together. We are unable to think systematically, system thinking. When Prof. Auda was presenting last Friday, many of us were watching. What is this? Where this man come from? What this type of thinking that puts things together and analyze the values, the sunan, the solutions, the context, all this. So that's the way forward in ISTAC here. And I think what Dr. ERMIN mentioned, when we select the right issues, the right topics, the right things, those things actually should stimulate us, push us to start thinking the bigger picture, start regaining back the Muslim mind that can think and provide solutions. That's why I think, Alhamdulillah, maybe our university after 40 years brought us to this stage where we get these scholars to talk about, disruption, these futuristic concepts of chaos and the complexity and post-normal. And all these are important if we really wanted to move forward in building the mind that can produce knowledge. So I think that that was a very wonderful talk and lecture from our doctor. I hope we can invite him to be a visiting professor or a distinguished fellow to stay with you for longer time in the future.
I did that once in 2010 when Fahim Zain was the dean. I
Good.
spent about 2 months in the summer
Wonderful.
here at ISTAC, and it was very productive. Actually.
That is very great, and that's why we need the mindset of our postgraduate student, our professors, our doctors to change, keeping the originality of the Muslim Ummah, of our text, of our Quran, of our Sunnah, of our heritage, and moving forward, because there is no way for us to play a role of Shahada. كذلك جعلناكم أمة وسطا لتكونوا شهداء على الناس, to be witness over all these nations and civilizations with this sophisticated ilm, with this sophisticated technology. If you don't raise to that level and go beyond to that level, and start producing solutions. So I think that's really great, and I'm very impressed. And thank you, Doctor, for this great lecture. And I thank all the people who are with us here, Professor Osman Bakar, Prof. Murad, Prof. Khaliq, many professors are there, and all our doctors and postgraduate students here. In the Zoom also, many people are there from Nigeria to Pakistan to Indonesia, to the Arab world. I see the faces here. Thank you for all your support. And I think that's the way forward. The way forward, pose deep, critical questions and get the right approaches to answer these questions and produce whatever ilm and knowledge we need for this ummah. May God bless you all. We end our lecture today with the reading of Surah Al-Asr, and then we will give the souvenir to our professor here, and we end with some refreshment and say Assalamu alaikum.